All right, let's continue this discussion of early Christianity. And let's talk about a group of people known as the apologists. These are people that sought to defend Christianity from Roman criticism. There were these competing philosophies introduced by the classical world, Greek world, or the Roman world. The job of the apologist was to offer a defense for Christianity. It's not an apology in the sense of I'm sorry. It's an apology in the sense of defending something. Okay, that's where we get the term apologetics from, the defense of Christianity. And the major thing I want the student to get out of this lecture is the ability to evaluate the use of philosophy in the Christian life. Is this something that can help us, or is it by nature something that will hinder us? There is a strain of thought out there that believes that all philosophy is anti-Christian, and I have a hard time with this personally. They reference Corinthians and the passage that talks about beware of vain philosophies. Well, when you look at that passage, the philosophies that they are referring to are very specific philosophies like Gnosticism and Docetism. It does not say avoid vain philosophy in general, but is making it specific to these things. And I would agree that not all philosophy is helpful for the Christian. However, to make the statement that philosophy is essentially an anti-Christian act is hard to defend using Scripture. Scripture is very clear that God creates all men in His image, and therefore we bear the marks of God in our life, and that's Christian and non-Christian, fallen and redeemed have this image of God. And a lot of theologians theorize that one of the components of this image is the ability to reason and think through something. The Bible is clear that God makes the rain fall on the just and the unjust alike. That's the classical verse in talking about a concept known as common grace. That's God gives grace to all of us, apart from saving grace. This is not saving grace we're talking about, but God gives grace to all of us. So to say that, no thinking developed by a non-Christian can ever be useful in the Christian life, I think it's just patently absurd. And it does not fit with either the testimony of the Scriptures, and it does not fit with the actual behavior of how the original Christians approached their task of defending Christianity in light of these philosophies. Because most of them, with one major exception, use philosophy in order to support the Christian faith. The first of these guys we're going to talk about is a guy named Justin Martyr. Martyr was not his last name. I think you can guess how his life ended. He was a philosopher who defended Christianity from Roman criticisms. And Rome had three major criticisms against Christianity. First, Rome believed that Christians were atheists. It sounds weird to us, but from the Roman perspective, it makes a lot of sense. When a Roman went to worship his or her god, they walked into a temple and they stood in front of a statue of their god and they offered worship. And then they come into a Christian church and there's no statue there. What are you worshiping? Yeah, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what they're doing in church, but they have their own logic to it, that they don't have any statue. They must worship nothing. So one of the accusations against Christians was that they were atheists. The second one is equally amusing, is that Christians, the Rome objected to Christianity because they practice incest. Christians would talk about greeting their brothers and sisters with a holy kiss. Now, if you're a Christian, you understand the context within which this is presented, but if this is a brand new idea and you see someone saying, hey brother, hey sister, and smooching them on the cheek, that might raise some eyebrows. That might, cause some misunderstandings. The third objection is also amusing to us today, is that they objected to Christians as cannibals. Not for the reason you might think. It wasn't just because of Eucharistic theology, but Christians talked of Jesus being the bread of life and the child of God, and they thought, now this is logic I can't follow as clearly, they thought somehow we would take babies and bake them into loaves of bread, and for communion we would slice up this bread baked with babies in it and consume it. If any or all three of those were actually true, Rome actually might have a legitimate beef against Christianity. But keep in mind, this was something new that Rome hadn't encountered before. This is new practice. It also didn't help that back in the day, communion was not open to everyone. Everyone who was not a confirmed member of the church had to leave the building during communion. So there was a lot of mystery as to what actually went on in there while they closed their doors. So Justin Martyr had to defend Christianity in light of these fairly odd accusations. And his method in doing so was to talk about the Logos. The Logos is a word that is very common in Greek philosophy, and it's a word used in our Bible to describe Jesus himself. Justin Martyr believed that Jesus was the most complete manifestation of the Logos, of the Word. However, prior to the coming of Jesus, common grace allowed for other people to be incomplete manifestations, to get it partially right. People like Greek philosophers and some of the early Hebrew thinkers that, Isaiah got most of the gospel in his book, but not all of it. So, Isaiah is a 100% reliable guide, but not necessarily a complete guide. To a certain extent, that's what Justin Martyr thought about some of the Greek philosophers, especially Plato. Justin Martyr thought Plato had come as close to discovering the gospel through common grace as any human could. Plato was still in need of special grace, of special revelation. But through general revelation, the revelation that God gives us all, Plato came pretty darn close to the gospel. When Jesus comes, he completes that and fulfills that, but it doesn't set up this situation where Greek philosophy was fundamentally at odds with Christian thought. But it was an earlier, incomplete, lesser version of Christian thought. Obviously, not all Greek philosophy falls in this category, but for Justin Martyr, Plato did. Justin Martyr uses an interesting analogy to show how philosophy is appropriate for the Christian life. And he shares this because this was a question that he had to face. Is it proper for Christians to engage in philosophy? And he talked about the gold of Egypt. When God led Israel out of Egypt, the Egyptians gave them their gold in the forms of idols, in the forms of ritual altar pieces, things that are dedicated to false idols. The Hebrews didn't say, "Oh, we can't accept this. This is dedicated to a false god. We cannot have anything to do with this." No, the Egyptians accepted it, and they melted it down and they used it for their own purpose. Now, admittedly, the first purpose that they used it for was to build a golden calf. God was not pleased with this. But God did not necessarily throw out the gold. It wasn't the gold's fault. It was the person using the gold's fault. And that same gold eventually became the material by which the instruments of the tabernacle were made out of. So that you can take something that is in the form of an idol and dedicate it to something that God is not pleased with and transform it into a powerful weapon for your faith. Justin Martyr used this analogy of the gold of Egypt to show how philosophy, even though it may be directed at something as Christians we don't fully support, it is something that God has created that Christians can use to worship God and to honor God. Okay. The second person we're going to talk about is somewhat of a mediating position in this question of what relationship does Christianity have with philosophy? A guy named Clement of Alexandria. Clement grew up in the nerdiest city in the ancient world, Alexandria, Egypt, home of the great library, home of a lot of schools of Platonists, and had an especially strong Platonic background. And Clement of Alexandria seems to be split in his evaluation of philosophy. On the one hand, he says philosophy is useful for the Christian, and on the other hand, he says you have to beware. This is not something that was originally designed for this use. And you guys will read his exhortation to the heathen and be able to discuss his position more fully in our discussion time. Now, the guy that represents the polar opposite position from Justin Martyr is a guy named Tertullian. Tertullian was not a philosopher by trade. He was a lawyer. Didn't have much use for abstract thinking. He liked concrete actions. The philosopher is steeped in Greek thought, in Greek philosophical tradition. A lawyer is more from a Roman context, from a political context. So for Tertullian to wade into these philosophical waters, he was kind of getting outside of his comfort zone to a certain extent. Lawyers are very practical. They use words with very specific meanings, and they tend to be very argumentative. Philosophers, they can explore things, they can discuss things. It's a little different. And in Tertullian's text on Prescription Against Heresies, he makes a very interesting statement. What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What has the academy to do with the church? And he's challenging this notion, what does darkness have with light? What does non-Christian thought have to do with Christian thought? These are opposites. And the job of the Christian is to throw out the non-Christian stuff. Okay? So as you read his against heretics, you'll get a better understanding of his position with that. But this period does show us three general approaches to how the Christian deals with classical thought. Justin Martyr, who fully embraces it, Clement of Alexandria, that reluctantly embraces it, and Tertullian, who flat out rejects it. After reading those texts, this will be the basis for our discussion as to what do we do with philosophy today. All right? I've already tipped my hand a little bit, but I think there is room for a variety of responses to this, and I look forward to hearing them from you. Thank you.